Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the wild, failure-fueled history of a company that is probably sitting in your living room right now. We're talking about Sony. We are going to see exactly how a tiny, incredibly scrappy post-World War II startup managed to survive absolute ruin, massive public betrayals, and devastating flops to become a $100 billion global empire.
But to really wrap our heads around Sony, we have to start with this unbelievable contrast. Picture 1945 Tokyo. It was, without a doubt, one of the worst places on Earth to try and start a business. The city was just bombed out ruins, police were basically non-existent, and legitimate jobs had entirely dried up. It was a time of pure, desperate survival. Yet, incredibly, out of that exact rubble, the modern $100 billion titan we know today was born.
So let's get into Section 1, From Ashes to Electronics. Back in 1945, engineers Akio Morita and Masaru Ibuka suddenly found themselves out of work. They'd actually met in the Navy designing tech for the war effort, which, frankly, they absolutely hated doing. They dreamed of building things that actually improved everyday civilian life. So when the war ended, they had nothing. But with a mere 190,000 yen borrowed from Akio's father, who shockingly let Akio walk away from a 300-year-old family brewery business to do this, they incorporated the company that would eventually become Sony.
Now, you might think they hit the ground running, but their early product history was a literal disaster. Masaru's first big idea was an electric rice cooker that either left the rice crunchily undercooked or just burned it to a total crisp. Next up, an electric heating blanket that was a massive fire hazard. But instead of throwing in the towel, they pivoted. During the war, the government had literally severed people's radio wires to block foreign propaganda. Now, folks desperately wanted to hear global news again, so Masaru just started repairing those damaged radios. That humble repair service got them featured in a magazine, and boom, it finally launched their real business.
Moving right along to Section 2, Redefining Made in Japan.
A little while later, Akio Morita traveled to the US and Germany, and he was completely stunned. These places were thriving, booming economies, skyscrapers everywhere, while Japan was still miles behind. But the real turning point? A cheap paper umbrella. Akio was at a German restaurant, and the waiter amusingly mocked a little decorative umbrella in his dessert just because it was made in Japan. Akio felt this profound, stinging embarrassment, and right then and there, he made it his life's absolute mission to change that global perception. He decided made in Japan was going to mean unmatched, premium quality.
But to take over the world, they knew they needed a brand name that anyone, anywhere, could easily pronounce. They were gearing up to license a revolutionary new American technology called the transistor, so they needed a fresh, catchy identity. They took Sonus, which is Latin for sound, and smashed it together with Sonny, a popular slang term for a sharp young man. Combine them, and you get Sony, short, totally global, and incredibly memorable. Putting that new name on the map, though, required a terrifying amount of risk. They basically bet the entire company on transistor radios, taking out massive bank loans to do it. And at first, they faced an agonizing 95% defect rate on their mass-produced transistors, just bleeding money. But they pushed through the pain and eventually created the TR-63, which they famously dubbed the world's first pocket-sized transistor radio. But here's the funniest part. It actually didn't fit in a standard shirt pocket. Sony literally had to manufacture custom shirts with oversized pockets for their salesmen to wear just to prove their point. And you know what? It worked. It was an instant, massive success.
They took that exact same relentless energy and aimed it right at color TV. Masaru insisted they engineer a completely new unit from absolute scratch, rather than just tweaking what was already out there. It was a brutal process. They even had to sell their defective early units at half the manufacturing cost just to get rid of them. But they wouldn't quit. They eventually perfected the Trinitron, which had a brilliantly sharp, bright image that totally blew the competition out of the water. It was so vastly superior, it actually won a 1973 Emmy Award and went on to sell 290 million units. Thanks to Sony, made in Japan officially meant top-tier quality.
Which brings us to Section 3, Triumphs and Betamax Tears.
In 1975, Sony rolled out Betamax, a truly revolutionary videocassette recorder. It had incredible image quality, and Sony had poured a fortune into developing it. But then, VHS entered the chat. Even though Sony's Betamax looked visually better, VHS completely won the format war. Why? Simply because VHS was cheaper and held 4 times as much video. You could record a whole football game or a super long movie on just one tape.
Sony lost millions here, but they learned a vital, hard truth. To the average consumer, convenience and price will almost always beat out pure visual quality. So, still stinging and bleeding money from the whole Betamax ordeal, Akio Morita makes this absolutely audacious ultimatum in 1979 about his next big idea. He flat out tells his team, if it doesn't sell over 30,000 units, I'll quit. He was literally betting his entire career on a portable cassette player with headphones. Now you have to remember, at the time, wearing headphones in public in Japan was considered kind of shameful. It was usually associated with hearing impairment. And since this device couldn't record audio, only play it, his own team thought he had completely lost his mind. They thought it was a guaranteed flop.
But man, Akio understood human desire so much better than his critics did. That massive gamble paid off to the tune of 385 million Walkman units sold. 385 million! Sony didn't just sell a cool gadget. They completely invented the concept of personal, on-the-go media. Taking your own curated soundtrack with you wherever you walked, that was an intoxicating new freedom, and it permanently cemented Sony as a global cultural icon. And their next big invention? It created an unstoppable financial engine. After 14 years of intense R&D with Philips, they co-invented the compact disc, the CD. But the genius here was the snowball effect they created. Think about it. They made money manufacturing the physical CDs. Then they made royalties licensing the format to other companies. Then they made money selling the actual Sony CD players to consumers. And finally, because they wanted the whole pie, not just a slice, they dropped $2 billion to buy CBS Records so they could own the actual music being played on those CDs. When one part of the business grew, the whole entire ecosystem exploded. Absolute masterclass in vertical integration.
All right, let's jump into Section 4, the console war betrayal.
By the early 90s, Sony wanted a piece of the booming video game market, so they partnered with the undisputed king at the time, Nintendo. They started co-developing a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. But behind the scenes, Nintendo executives were getting incredibly paranoid. They started worrying that if game developers got used to CDs, Sony might just launch their own console and steal the whole industry. So in one of the wildest moves in tech history, Nintendo shockingly and publicly betrayed Sony. Right at a major trade show, Nintendo announced they were partnering with Philips instead, which ironically was the exact company Sony had co-invented the CD with.
As you can imagine, Sony's executives were absolutely livid. But they used that rage as rocket fuel. Sony decided to push forward entirely alone in 1994. And their CD-based PlayStation was a developer's absolute dream. While Nintendo was still forcing developers to cram their games onto expensive, restrictive cartridges with tiny file sizes, the PlayStation used CDs. This meant massive, highly ambitious file sizes and far cheaper production costs. Third-party developers flocked to Sony in droves.
The fallout from that betrayal was total domination. The PlayStation 1 absolutely crushed the competition, selling around 100 million units compared to the Nintendo 64's 32 million. Nintendo essentially created their own worst nightmare. But this massive victory also taught Sony a super crucial lesson. Having the best hardware isn't enough anymore. They realized it is absolutely essential to own your own intellectual property. Massive games like Ratchet & Clank, God of War, Gran Turismo. If you want to control the market, you absolutely have to own the content.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Spider-Man and Cyber Attacks.
$7 million. Let that sink in. Back in 1998, Marvel was clawing its way out of a brutal bankruptcy, and they desperately needed cash. Sony Pictures swooped in and bought the exclusive film rights to Marvel's absolute biggest character, Spider-Man, for a measly $7 million. And the deal is, as long as Sony releases a Spider-Man movie every few years, they get to keep those rights forever. That single tiny purchase has turned into an asset that's generated nearly $9 billion for Sony across all those blockbuster films.
But of course, you can't talk about that win without talking about the colossal missed opportunity that came with it. During those exact same negotiations in 1998, Marvel actually offered Sony the film rights to almost all of their other characters. Think Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, for a grand total of just $25 million. But Sony executives actually said no. They literally told Marvel that nobody cared about those other characters. Considering the billions upon billions the Marvel Cinematic Universe has made since then, that has got to be one of the most expensive no's in the history of entertainment. Ouch.
And Hollywood didn't just bring missed opportunities, it brought completely new, terrifying vulnerabilities.
In 2014, Sony was hit by a devastating cyber attack from a hacker group calling themselves the Guardians of Peace. It was totally unprecedented. They stole terabytes of data, completely wiped company hard drives, and leaked highly embarrassing executive emails alongside unreleased movies. This all went down right as Sony was about to release The Interview, a comedy that mocked the leader of North Korea. Now, just reporting the facts here, while the FBI officially pointed the finger at North Korea for the hack, a lot of prominent cybersecurity experts remain highly skeptical of that claim even today, leaving the true identity of the hackers still a bit of a mystery.
But honestly, despite the massive hacks, the brutal format wars, and those early, highly dangerous rice cookers, just look at what Sony has evolved into today. They've expanded way, way beyond consumer electronics into a wildly diversified empire. We're talking life insurance, banking, biotechnology, advanced robotics like those famous little robot dogs, and they are even pushing into electric cars. It proves that their foundational willingness to take immense risks, to fail, and to pivot when necessary is still completely alive and well today. So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. How completely different would our daily lives, our music habits, our video games, and our movie theaters look today if two guys hadn't stubbornly tried to fix radios in the bombed-out rubble of 1945? Sony's whole journey is the ultimate proof that sometimes your greatest, most embarrassing failures are actually just the raw materials for your eventual empire. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.